When the Marvel Legends Avengers 60th anniversary series was first announced, I assumed they would be drip feeding these figures out across the whole year because, frankly, there's just so many of them. But instead, it seems like Hasbro's approach has been to drop them pretty much all at once, which has proven to be a little bit challenging to keep up. And that's not even beginning to touch on the impact on my poor wallet. So without further ado, let's take a look at this deluxe set. It's Hawkeye with his Skycycle. So starting off by taking a look at the packaging, the first thing to note is that this is oblong square packaging. Of course it is plastic free, so there is no window display here, but this is a strict square. Now some of the other sets we've seen for the two figure sets that have been released recently have been more of a trapezoid shape, whereas this is more of a square or a straight oblong. Now this is plastic free, so that means there is no window display here, but we do have this really nice central photo of the toy itself, which looks really fun and interesting because it's in an action pose, and I think this sells it quite nicely. Behind that photo we can see this classic comic book image of Hawkeye, which I think is quite attractive. And the design layout for this series of 60th anniversary figures employs an awful lot of white space. Now this makes the remaining images quite striking and visual and strong, but it also makes the remainder of the packaging look a little bit bland, a little bit washed out. So I kind of have mixed feelings about this, but I think this is one of the better examples. I think this is actually quite presentable and quite displayable, mainly because we have one strong central image on the front of the packaging. Now if we look at the side panels, we can see on one side we have this illustrated image, again taken directly from the source, the comic books themselves, which look really quite striking. If we flip it and look at the other side, we can see this digital rendering of what the action figure looks like. So again, depending on your display preferences, you can stack this up on your shelf next to your other figures in this collection and see the version that you want to put on display. Then if we look at the reverse of the packaging, we can see the collage of Avengers in the background. We can see photos of both the figure and the Skycycle and his various accessories. And again, this looks pretty presentable. I think this is a lot more colourful than what we see on the front because there's a lot more blue here, a lot less of that white space. As has been the case with the rest of the figures in this series so far, the outer card is actually very, very flimsy. It's almost paper thin, but not quite. Inside we have this much thicker, more robust card, and of course we can see all the various elements within the packaging there, wrapped up in rice paper. So I think it's fair to say that we're long overdue a classic Hawkeye figure in this series, and for the most part I think they've done a pretty stellar job with him. The detailing and the colouring of the costume looks to be pretty much pitch perfect really, and of course whilst this isn't his original look, his original outfit, this is probably his most famous appearance. This is his definitive look, I would probably argue, simply because this is the costume that he wore pretty consistently from the 70s all the way through the 80s, 90s and even the very early 2000s, with minor tweaks and variations here and there, but for the most part I think this is what people think of when they think of Hawkeye, and it's probably my favourite version of his costume, and I think they've done a very nice job of capturing the colours and the little details of the costume. And whilst we've had a few Hawkeyes in the series so far, I do believe that this is a brand new head sculpt, and for me the proportions on this sculpt, the look on his face and the paint apps, particularly around the eyes and the lips, are really, really excellently done, and I would probably say this is the best head sculpt we've had of Hawkeye so far in this series. I really like it. I think it's very, very strong. Likewise, when we look at the torso, this seems to be a fresh sculpt. This seems to be at least tweaked from the initial Hawkeye releases we've seen across the years. And again, I think they've done a very nice job. He looks to be really neatly in proportion. It's nice to see the things like the chainmail, the top of his vest there being sculpted in. Likewise, the two sort of ribbon effects on the central part of his chest and upper torso are all neatly sculpted in there. And I think they look pretty accurate. I think they've done a very nice job. However, the one criticism I would have of this figure overall is that, once again, we're not really seeing much in the way of paint apps or paint washes here, which is a real shame because we have a really fantastic sculpt, and I think just a light wash here and there would just bring out some of these details. Just a little bit of shading would add so much more depth and texture to this figure, so it's a shame they just missed that really, because it would have really capitalised on what is otherwise a really nice looking figure. Hasbro have clearly thought through the practical implications of having him sit on a Skycycle, so they've given him these cotton tassels at the bottom of his tunic, and I have to say I think this works tremendously well. Even taking out the practical implications, I just think this looks a lot better, a lot smoother, and it adds extra depth and texture to this figure. The belt around his upper torso is a separate piece. This is quite nicely sculpted and well painted, and I think this flexibility works quite well. However, you will notice that the armbands are also a separate piece, and they have a tendency to want to slip down and fall down past his arms, which I'm not as keen on this. I would much rather they've sculpted these actually into the bicep. Okay, so let's take a look at the articulation. He does have a ball joint at the top of the neck there, so he can spin his head all the way around. Oddly, there isn't much room for him to lean his head from left to right, which was a real surprise, but he can nod his head up and down a pretty healthy distance. As you would expect, he has ball joints in the shoulders which allow his arms to kick all the way up and out. This is supported by a bicep swivel and double joints in the elbows, allowing that lower forearm to lean all the way back, which is great to see. And I have to say, the plastic they've used feels solid and strong, and none of those rubbery issues we've seen in recent releases, which is really nice to see. Now he's got a pin swivel at the wrist, so that can rotate all the way around, and of course it hinges forwards and backwards. He's got a straight swivel at the waist, allowing him to move from side to side, and then he has an ab crunch in the centre of the torso, allowing him to bend forwards and backwards a little bit. There's the typical ball joints in the hips, allowing the legs to kick out to the side. There's the complementary thigh swivel at the top there, and there's also a swivel at the top of the boot cut as well. So the legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards. There's another double joint at the knee, allowing that lower leg to kick all the way back there, which is great. And then we have the ankle pivot at the bottom of the boot as well, allowing that foot to hinge forwards and backwards and arch from side to side. He also comes with quite a few fun accessories as well, including an alternate pair of closed fist hands, a quiver full of arrows that are all moulded in. These aren't removable, there's nothing you can do with these, and they obviously slot into the hole on his back, an individual arrow, and of course his bow. I really like the approach they've taken with the bow. It is a very nice colour, it is moulded in these plastics. There's a little bit of detail on it, although not a huge amount to be honest. But what's most impressive about it is the actual string to the bow is a separate piece of plastic, but it feels nice and robust, but also fairly flexible so that he can get his hands to pull it back a little bit, which is fantastic. My only criticism would be though that he doesn't have a hand that's really moulded to hold an arrow alongside the bow, which is a real shame. I would like to be able to place the arrow in his grip and him to be sort of arching it as if he's ready to fire the bow, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to really be an option. Nothing that I've been able to do has been able to replicate that look. And there's nothing about either gripping hand that really allows the figure to comfortably hold this arrow. You can just about grip it at the end because that's the only piece that's thick enough to fit in the grip. And it's a real shame that they didn't have the foresight to include an extra hand that allows the figure to actually comfortably hold this arrow in the bow. But with that being said, I have to say you can get some really fun poses out of this. You can get him to grip the string of the bow if nothing else, and this looks really good. And I have to say, I think it looks really presentable and really fun, and he's really bright and colourful, and I just think they've done an excellent job with the overall presentation. There's just a few little tweaks here and there that could have made this perfect. So here he is standing next to the original Hawkeye, the first Hawkeye in the Marvel Legends line. This was produced by Toy Biz many years ago, and I remember this was a notoriously difficult figure to track down and get hold of, and it used to go for absolutely silly money on the secondary market. Sadly, I was never able to track one down myself. It was very much on my wish list for a great many years, but I never actually managed to track him down. But it's funny because as with all things over time, this now looks a little bit clunky, a little bit silly, a little bit out of proportion in places, and just a little bit gawky by comparison. I have to say this new version from Hasbro is much superior in my opinion. I think the proportions all look right, his costume looks a lot more accurate to the comic books and the source material, and I just think it's a lot more striking. Hasbro have also offered up a couple of previous attempts at Hawkeye in the series so far. We can see on the right hand side, the far right, the Dark Avengers version of Hawkeye with that long sleeve there and slightly darker colours, and then we can see this tweaked version with some slight variations to paint and colour, and of course this is a classic Hawkeye. So when we stand these side by side, again I think this new release is infinitely superior. I just really much prefer the sculpting in the face, particularly the ears of the mask, for lack of a better term, and I just think proportionally it just looks a lot tighter. The colorization on this new figure is just a lot brighter, a lot more colourful, and just looks a lot more source accurate. Okay, so let's take a look at the Skycycle. Now it does come in 3 pieces and of course alongside a display stand as well, and it's relatively easy to assemble. You just snap the pieces into place and it looks pretty tight and secure once it's all in place. And I have to say, I think they've done an absolutely tremendous job with this Skycycle. All of these pieces are brand new as far as I can tell, and I think the bulk of the retooling has gone into this, and I think it's paid off dividends. What's really interesting about it is that whilst obviously artistic license varies from artist to artist, they've done a pretty nice job of replicating what we see on the page from some of these comic books, and I think it looks really, really good and actually weirdly quite effective. Now I must admit I found it a little bit tricky to get him to actually sit down on the seat whilst gripping the handlebars, but this is a minor gripe. It actually doesn't look too bad when you see it like this, just a slight gap there, but all in all this looks really dynamic and really fun and really surprisingly effective when you put it on display. The sculpting is really nice and it's actually got a lot of little details in it which is really fun. There's not much in the way of paint apps though, there's not many paint washers running through this again, which is a shame because the detail is there and it would have really helped pluck that out. Instead they've opted for a number of different coloured plastics here and there to give it more of a metallic texture, which works pretty well, but it would have just been nice to have had it enhanced with a bit of a wash here and there to really pull out some of these details. Where we can see some paint is on the exhaust, and I think this looks really, really effective. Likewise, we can see some very fine paint apps on this sort of central control or dashboard, which looks really good and just adds a little bit of detail and texture, which is really pleasant to see. Overall though, I think this looks absolutely tremendous and is really, really fun. I was initially a little bit skeptical about the display stand. We've had this included in other figures in the past. I can think of, for example, the Demogoblin Builder figure, which definitely struggled with balancing and had a tendency to overbalance if you placed the weight in the wrong place. Now, for the most part, this survives surprisingly well and can actually accommodate a lot of different extreme poses, but you do have to be mindful that there are certain points of balance where it will topple over, particularly if you lean it backwards or too much to the side. But actually, it has a pretty decent broad range and can manage a lot of great poses. So I was actually very pleasantly surprised by this. And just for a quick height and scale comparison, here is the Hawkeye figure standing next to the Skycycle on its display stand. So as you can see, it's actually got quite a bit of height to it, and it's actually quite a bulky cycle in itself. So I think this looks really cool and definitely warrants being a deluxe release. So in summary then, I'm going to give this figure a 4 stars. Now I must admit I did toy with the idea of giving it 5 stars, but there was just a couple of things that niggled me that I felt I had to just remove 1 star. But all in all, this is a really nice figure. This is a really nice set as a whole. I think the figure is really, really nicely done. I think this is probably the best version of this character we've had in the Marvel Legends line to date. I think it's the most accurate in terms of the look and costume and the overall proportions of the figure. I think his accessories are quite fun, although a little bit limited, but I think it looks really, really good. It looks fantastic on display. I really like that he has the cotton ribbons, tassels at the front there to help him sit down. I think it looks really nice, and it just is really colourful and fun and really nicely done, nicely sculpted and nicely presented. Now, my criticism of the figure, as you've already ascertained, is that I'm just a little bit disappointed by the lack of paint washing running through this figure. It's not massively detrimental, but it just would have enhanced it ever so slightly. My other criticism would be around those extra pieces, particularly the armbands on his arms there that have a tendency to fall down. I wish they just sculpted this in to make the look consistent and, you know, make posing him a lot more simple and straightforward, having to worry about adjusting that every 5 minutes. My biggest criticism though is the fact that they didn't give him a specially moulded hand that would allow him to hold his arrow as if he was arching, ready to fire his bow. I think that's a real shame that they didn't think that through, because that's something I think most fans would expect in this day and age. If you're going to have a character like this, that he should be able to feel as if he's ready to fire that arrow, because he does come with a single loose arrow, so of course you're going to want to put it in his bow. So I just wish they thought that through a little bit more, and it's a real shame that they didn't consider that. For me, the Skycycle is just the icing on the cake, but I have to praise it because I think they've done a really nice job of replicating what we see on the page. It's quite true to source, which is really fun. I think they've done a really nice job with the moulding and sculpting of it, and, you know, to be fair, I think what paint apps are there are really nice. Again, my one criticism here would be I just wish they just had a bit more of a paint wash running through just to, you know, capitalise on this great sculpt and just bring out some of that depth and texture. I'm really pleased that it does actually manage to stand on the stand really well, and that you can pose it in multiple different extreme extreme poses without it toppling over for the most part, I think is really successful. So again, I have to say, I give them top marks for this. I think this looks really, really good. So there you have it. I think this is a really solid entry. As I said, for me, this is probably the definitive version of Hawkeye that we've had in this series so far, and I think he's tremendously fun to add. So if you're a Hawkeye fan or an Avengers fan, and you feel like you haven't quite got the Hawkeye you've always longed for, then this is, I think, the one for you. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.